Welcome, everybody. It's Sunday, December 19th at noon Eastern, and this is Parapsychology Foundation Presents Book Expo 2015. As you probably remember, on the day we had quite a bit of trouble with Dr. Kelly and Allene Signal. They were having server problems with IQ, but it's all sorted and everything is wonderful now. So this is our reschedule of Alleen's very much anticipated talk. And in the meantime, the book was on the horizon in November, and now it is out, which is wonderful. And you'll have the link to go and buy it at the end of the talk. So Allene Symons is the author of Nostradamus, Vagabond Prophet, a novel of his life and time, and an instructor of communications and media studies at Santa Ana College. She previously worked as a senior editor at Publishers Weekly. I'm so impressed about that. Drugstore News and for the Pharmacist magazines, and as general manager of Rizzoli International Bookstore in Costa Mesa, California. So this is very extraordinary. It's Aldous Huxley's Hands, His Quest for Perception, and the Origin and Return of Psychedelic Science. Don Lattin, the author of the Harvard Psychedelic Club and Distilled Spirits, wrote, "What can be said about the work of Aldous Huxley that hasn't already been told?" Quite a bit, it turns out. In this compelling narrative, Allene Symons uncovers a cache of letters between Huxley and the man who turned him on to psychedelic drugs, using those documents to spin a delightful tale of two men exploring the thin line between mysticism and madness. Symons deftly blends the legwork of a journalist with the passion of a daughter fascinated by her own father's unlikely foray into Huxley's inner circle. Doesn't that sound wonderful? I'm going to get out of your way. Allene, here's your slide, and take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks for your time today. By way of introducing this book, I'll say that Aldous Huxley's Hands traces a little-known byway in their exploration of consciousness that involved Huxley and members of an unusual circle of his friends, one of whom was my father. Huxley, of course, is best known for his dystopian novel, Brave New World, and for his 1954 book, in which he explored his experience with mescaline, a psychedelic drug, that book being The Doors of Perception, for which, by the way, the band The Doors was named. So I guess what I'd say is, in the details in Huxley's life and work, in the areas of parapsychology and seeming psychic phenomena, there are many more connections than most people are aware of. And I've tried to tease them out and illuminate them in my contribution in this book. Many think of Huxley as the literary godfather of psychedelics, but the full spectrum of extraordinary perception fascinated him to the end of his life. And along with his friends in this inner circle, which often met during the 1950s on Tuesday nights in his home, Huxley and his friends explored hypnosis, including age regression hypnosis, remote communication, non-traditional healing. He held seances in his home, as did my father when I was growing up. And Huxley also wrote, and few people are aware of this, on what he called the post-human state, implying the possibility of a continuing individual consciousness after death. Famously, if one looks in his biography, although you only see a line or so, for example, he guided his first wife, Maria, in her last hours by reading passages from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which he took very seriously. Among his friends, germane to this image we have on the screen, was the founder of the Parapsychology Foundation, Mrs. Eileen Garrett. This picture was taken at her conference at La Piole in the south of France in 1961, and there's Aldous being interviewed by a French journalist whose name I could not figure out. The first time Aldous attended one of the conferences was in 1954, and that was kind of a landmark year because that was the year his book, The Doors of Perception, came out, and he was one of the presenters on that topic. But many other topics were discussed then, as I think you're all aware, being interested in the Parapsychology Foundation. The topics that particular year in 1954 also included non-traditional healing, which was another of Huxley's interests, and one of the interests that overlapped between he and my father. Huxley moved to LA from the UK in 1937 on the eve of World War II. And an interesting biographical twist most people aren't aware of is that despite his fascination, even obsession with all aspects of perception, Huxley was nearly blind. He'd had an eye infection at the age of 17, and most of his vision did not recover. So he, through most of his life, was managed with a little spyglass and a little magnifying glass. But that didn't prevent him from even writing art criticism as a journalist, by the way. So one of his friends in LA who had similar interests was, again, my father. One of their shared passions was an interest in the hands, which is on the cover of my book, which you see in the image. My dad took these unusual photographs. He was an engineer and became kind of obsessed with this project. And Huxley's interest in the hands had gone back to the early 1930s. He'd studied with Charlotte Wolff, who was a German emigre, and was very interested in what different aspects of the hand might reveal about human traits. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. So other friends of Aldous's I wanted to mention included such, luminaries as Gerald Hurd, who was known as first as a BBC science commentator, but went on to write a lot of very influential books. And he and Aldous established a retreat in the hills of Orange County, where I happen to live now, called Trabuco College. And one of the main focuses on this college or spiritual retreat was their studies in ESP. It was mostly thought of as kind of a seed retreat for what became the Vedanta Society, which now owns that monastery. Maria Huxley called it Gerald Hurd's monastery. But people came from around the country to be involved in these experiments with ESP, parapsychology, psychic phenomena, and much of this isn't really recognized. For one thing, people don't like to talk about, in most of the biographies, the biographers really prefer to talk about Aldous as a literary figure, not Aldous and his interests in paranormal pursuits, I guess we could call them. So other people in that circle included, of course, Humphrey Osmond, who was the psychiatrist who famously gave Aldous the mescaline, and that, of course, resulted in Aldous writing the book, The Doors of Perception. Other friends included Hereward Carrington, whose name I know because I guess I'll say a little more about how this book came about in a minute. But among my father's documents, I found materials that indicated who some of Huxley's friends, lesser-known friends, were. I don't mean lesser known in the larger world. Someone like Hereward Carrington was important in the Society for Psychical Research, but they weren't really known in the world of Aldous Huxley biography. So I should mention another theme that runs through the book that pertains to this area of parapsychology and seeming psychic phenomena, and that is the still unsolved mystery of schizophrenia. A central area of my father's hand study involved the hands of schizophrenic patients. And my dad took almost 1,000 photographs of hands. This was the reason Aldous invited him, by the way, to join his group of seekers. My dad was granted permission to access, even though he was an engineer and an amateur researcher, he was granted permission by the state of California to take photographs of the hands of schizophrenic patients at 2 mental institutions in California. Dr. Humphrey Osmond, the psychiatrist who gave Huxley the mescaline, which resulted in the book The Doors of Perception, his specialty was also schizophrenia. And both my father and Humphrey Osmond came to the conclusion that there were some very interesting overlaps in the area of ESP research and some of the patients who had schizophrenic episodes, extreme schizophrenic episodes. My father also found an overlap, he believed, between some of the high-functioning ESP performers who were also schizophrenic and hand structure that he identified in one particular part of the hand. He also saw this in the hands of a group of trance mediums that he happened to include in his photographic study. Interestingly, this is an area of research that is being pursued today by the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dean Radin at their conference last summer mentioned this, and I went up to him afterwards and mentioned this was an aspect of my father's study as well. They're looking at that overlap between schizophrenia and high-functioning performers in ESP, and perhaps those who are recognized as trance mediums. So I wanted to digress a bit into that, but that's kind of an unusual aspect of my book that really hasn't been pursued. I was looking for some of these connections that in Aldous Huxley's life that I think draw attention to them, because Huxley is such a highly recognizable figure, as is the subject of psychedelics. I must say, the media really lights up on the subject of psychedelics, as I think you're all aware. So I like about how I've woven these together that it draws some attention to some of Huxley's other interests and some of these studies that really probably develop reevaluation in this day and age of digital modeling and so forth. The last chapter of my book looks at how interests in Huxley's circle of friends continue today. Many of you are involved in such work, as is the Parapsychology Foundation. I wanted to mention, too, that, again, this little-known aspect of Aldous Huxley that his biographers tend to write off in a footnote. They might mention the Tuesday night group. They might mention hypnosis, but they tend not to look at the breadth of areas that he was interested in that you can tease out from his work. I wanted to read one little quote from my book that was written by another of Huxley's many interesting colleagues, who, by the way, Aldous and Gerald Hurd and Christopher Isherwood were among those who wrote for Eileen Garrett's journal, Tomorrow, back in the 1950s and early 60s. Christopher Isherwood, you may recognize the name from his literary life. He probably most famously wrote the Berlin stories that turned into Cabaret, but he's also known for a lot of his writing in the area, such as Christopher and His Kind, talking about his life as a gay man. But he was a good friend of Aldous's, and they wrote some screenplays together. And one of those screenplays ties into this interest in hands. In the 1940s, Aldous had a ranch in the Mojave Desert. And as the story goes, and this is in his biography, in some of his other official biographies, there was a healer in the area of the Mojave Desert called Llano del Rio. And Aldous was fascinated by this, of course, and so was Christopher Isherwood, who was very involved in these ESPs and other studies in psychic phenomena. They wrote a screenplay called Jacob's Hands. It was rejected by the studios, who otherwise really lapped up Huxley's work. Huxley wrote screenplays for many of the major studios, mostly adaptations. But this book, Jacob's Hands, languished in a drawer for 50 years. It was finally published as a little novella, they called it fable, in the 1990s. And so it's interesting that this came out 50 years after his death. I wanted to give you a quote from Christopher Isherwood, who wrote this, or first spoke it, at the Huxley Memorial after Huxley died in 1963. And this short quote was in my book as well. Christopher Isherwood said of Aldous questioned unseekingly, and it never occurred to him to bother about the neighbors. They laughed at him for consulting unlicensed healers and investigating psychic phenomena. And it was true that many of the healers proved to be wrong, and many of the mediums frauds, but that was unimportant from Aldous's point of view. For his research also brought into his hands some very odd and precious pieces of the jigsaw puzzle of truth, pieces that may not be officially fitted into the main pattern and recognized as scientifically respectable for many more years to come. That was in 1963, at Aldous Huxley's memorial, and published in the memorial volume about Aldous Huxley. So I suppose, in closing, again, I might say that about my introduction to the book, that many of you are working in this area now, I know. And so Huxley's legacy is, with his special circle of friends, including Eileen Garrett, is certainly alive and well in all of your work. I know I think I have the time then to go into some of the other bullet points. So what motivated me to take on this project was finding in my family garage, my grandparents' garage, all these photographs of hands. And I remembered them from when I was a kid because I helped my dad in the darkroom. So I really had no idea what this was all about. And as I dug through these boxes that had been lost in the back of the old garage that my family had owned since the 1920s, I found a note to my parents from Aldous Huxley and Maria Huxley, which stunned me because I'd worked in book publishing in New York, and to see that my parents were connected to Aldous Huxley just blew me away. And then I found a few other things in the boxes, a letter from J.B. Rhine, Dr. J.B. Rhine, to my father. And then I found the index cards that went with these photographs, and I realized that one of them was the hand of Aldous Huxley. I recognized the name Gerald Hurd. I started looking through and Googling some of these names and realizing it's genus Sermonara. Some of these people, Hereward Carrington, and often they were clustered in groups that meant that they'd been taken at the same time. I determined that many of these were on Tuesday nights in the home of Aldous Huxley on North Kings Road in Hollywood. So that started giving my book a shape, and it motivated me to pursue what this was all about. Because I grew up in a household where there were seances and where I ended up studying the history of religions, primarily Buddhism, my first graduate work, I felt that this was a story I had to tell, and I felt that I was the one to tell it, and it took me about a decade to do it. And my goals included, for example, I wanted to get this in the record, both my father's work and this side of Aldous Huxley that tends to be shunted aside. How I went about writing it, following these pursuits, interviewing my dad before he died, following the leads as best I could, and they led me to some interesting places. One was the partner of Humphrey Osmond, Dr. John Smithies, who was alive in his 90s and still affiliated with the University of California, San Diego. And he was a great resource. He'd written a private memoir. He also led me to Humphrey Osmond's daughter, who loaned me the original set of letters between Osmond and Huxley during this time period. And for any of you doing that kind of research, what an amazing thing to have all those letters, on your desk for an unlimited amount of time. She just said, take your time. And to read the sequence of the chronology of how psychedelics came to be, how their word came to be coined, how Humphrey Osmond and Aldous were interested in all these areas of research in psi and in age regression hypnosis, and some remarkable things that you don't think about in connection with, say, a psychiatrist who really became closely associated with the psychedelic revolution. And over the years, one thing I wanted to mention too, what comes to mind is a quote from John Bealoff, who said, I'm only approximating the quote, but it had to do with many of us who come into this area of interest in research and writing, come to it from a family background that brought with it those stories that become part of our family legacy. And also many of us come into it because of our own personal experiences. And I have had many surprising and spontaneous experiences in my life, which when I thought about my family weren't so surprising. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my process of writing the book and getting it published. I think most of you are published and you've had your own journeys along the way to publication. And in this day and age, it isn't as easy as it was a few years ago when my first books were published. But initially, I'd interviewed my father, and then I followed the leads that led me to John Smithies. And John Smithies, by the way, was also a member of the Society for Psychical Research in the 1950s, as were a number of Huxley's colleagues, including Gerald Hurd. And I kept tracking down material, including other material at the UCLA and the special Aldous Huxley collection there, as well as at Huntington Library here, which had quite a collection of Aldous Huxley material, and now has the Isherwood collection as well. As far as getting it published, three things helped get this book published. And remember, it's a trade book, not an academic book. One was at the suggestion of a former agent, one of my first agents. We were together for a while. She wanted me to bring in my own point of view. And I think that helped a lot because there's a sense of immediacy about it that I think in today's reading today's books from a trade publisher helps the reader stay active. It's almost like being interactive with the author. The other thing was carrying the chronology into the present. The end of my book is about the return of psychedelic science. I talk primarily about the origins with Aldous Huxley, Humphrey Osmond, that early period. Then I take a leap. I touch on the 60s because I was at San Francisco State in the 60s, so folks, you can imagine I have firsthand experience of such things. But my agent and then the publisher really wanted me to bring this to current research in psychedelic science, which is fascinating. It's also interesting because two of the leading areas of research, which are being done by such universities as UCLA and Johns Hopkins, Columbia, and also in the UK, The two leading areas in this country are studies related to victims of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because again, the grant money is there. And of course, you probably all know that makes a big difference in the work you can do. And the other area that's really leading the charge on this is research into the use of psychedelics with therapy for those who are facing terminal cancer at the end of life. Now, several of these areas were undertaken back in the 50s and 60s before psychedelic studies were banned. First, they were banned in terms of the layperson having their hands on them, and then they were banned in the area of research. So there was a dry stretch there for a couple of decades. But now that it's back, in this country at least, although it's more liberal, I understand, in the UK, in this country, these studies have to get past the DEA and other barriers. And so the areas that help them get past that barrier are showing the medical viability of using psychedelic tools. And the tools are not used independently, they're used in therapeutic settings. So this is not a matter of a prescription drug that you can get on the internet. It's really much more controlled, and much more controlled than it was, by the way, back in the 1950s, when the name Timothy Leary, I think, is familiar to most of you, who was initially a researcher at Harvard and was doing some very legitimate studies. But his studies kind of went way beyond the bonds of the guidelines, and that became a problem, and he was pretty much forced to resign. After that, of course, he decided to go very mainstream and coined the term turn on, tune in, and drop out, which a lot of the college students picked up in the 1960s. And that largely led to the banning of psychedelic drugs in this country. So the other thing then, which relates to that, is my publisher wanted the subtitle to emphasize psychedelics, even though that's only part of the study in the book or part of the story in the book. My pet aspect of the book, of course, and the part I really feel I bring to this, is Huxley's interest in these other areas that pertain to parapsychology and related fields. The question about how the book's received so far, well, it just came out this week on Tuesday. I did a virtual book launch, which was great fun. I had one of my former students help me do this. He's my social media advisor, and we had a good time. I was intimidated at first. We did this through my Facebook page for Aldous Huxley's Hands, but I had a great time. We reached a couple hundred people. People interacted with me. I posted lots of images related to the book, the little mini blogs every half hour, and that was quite fun. And I understand that there's really some action on the book out there, especially online. My publisher ran the excerpt chapter on psychedelics today on a website called Alternet. And Alternet, many of you may be familiar with it. It's interested in, I guess, an update on some of the what you might have earlier called counterculture. But I think that caused quite a bit of action on the book. So the book just came out Tuesday. I've had fun this week. I've been hearing from people. I've been getting invitations. So I think it's going to do well. And as far as the question of what's next, I think I'm going to be working with this book for quite a while because there seems to be an interest in several aspects of it. And as far as what's next, then I might take some of my father's work. Maria's, Aldous Huxley's second wife, Laura Huxley, who I met with twice before she passed away. We talked about this, and she knew about the hand study. And she encouraged me in her own way. She said, you have all these slides, and they are, by the way, in very good shape. She said, maybe someone would be interested in scanning these in and taking a look at this using today's models. So I might just get this material organized, because now that the book is out, its first week born, I may be hearing from some people interested in that aspect of the study as well. So that's probably going to keep me busy on another level. So I think that probably, to a certain extent, sums up what I wanted to say about the book. And I think in this format, although this is new to me, I believe, Nan, are we open for questions, or how do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, definitely. We can do questions. Guys, you can write them in the chat. I was mentioning that Charlie Tart, who was an early grantee of Eileen Garrett was a very important guy at the beginning of in the 60s in working on altered states and psychoactive substances. Has been a lifelong contributor to our field, and now David Luke at the University of Greenwich combines research on parapsychology with research on psychopharmaceuticals. So there's certainly still quite a lot of overlap. One of the things I would like to ask you is if you can talk a little bit more about what you learned about Aldous Huxley's relationship with Eileen Garrett and the Parapsychology Foundation. I know Lisette has talked about your research, and she's apologetic that she couldn't be here today. She had some family things that she had to do. She was so delighted that you agreed to be part of the Book Expo. But that's something I'm interested in, and then we can move to Shirley's question.
Okay, yes. Well, and after Aldous moved to the States in 1937, and he expected to go back to the UK actually, but of course the World War II came along, and everything just kind of evolved towards his becoming an expat here. I think a lot of this evolved in a way from his friend Gerald Hurd. When they came to the States together to give lectures on trying to avoid World War II, they were both part of the Peace Pledge Union. And as part of that, before they traveled around the country, Gerald Hurd had been invited to be a lecturer at Duke University. And Duke University was the seat of the Rhine research. And as many of you may be aware, much of that was funded by Eileen Garrett and one of her sponsors. So that takes it back to that point. So at that point, as Aldous is now in the States and living in Los Angeles, which was at that of New Thought, version 1, version 2 being probably in the 60s, related to spirituality from the Far East, flooding into Los Angeles and Southern California came Rosicrucians and lots of different groups that were very active here. Vedanta Society. This was just a time when this was just a real maelstrom of ideas. And here's Huxley, who was constantly open to new ideas and loved writing about them. He was always looking for his next essay, his next book, his next novel. His accounts sort of summarized or explained a little bit how all this worked in these evenings when he was sort of, my dad would say, picking people's brains. So all this is now in the middle of all of this. He embraces it. He starts to absorb it. And this combined with Gerald Hurd's interests at Duke University with Rhine, again sponsored by Eileen Garrett and her sponsor, Francis Bolton, this kind of converged, and Aldous then became a friend of Eileen Garrett. And this was the way that this British expat group often found their new friends and their new interests. They would connect each other. You know, Gerald Hurd might say, "So Aldous, you must meet this woman," or Christopher Isherwood might say, "Oh, you must come to the Vedanta Society. You have to come and try this see this guru and see what he has to say." So it was quite a convergence. And again, these gentlemen, intellectual gentlemen, all ended up writing for Eileen Garrett's Tomorrow magazine as well. So this all became a nexus of friends with similar interests. And then Huxley, of course, was then at that point in touch with Eileen Garrett. And a lot of this, as he met Humphrey Osmond, was filtered through Humphrey Osmond. I understand that there's a very large collection of letters between Humphrey Osmond and Eileen Garrett. Osmond's daughter told me this. But Osmond had a little different time frame to work all of this. Huxley wrote over 1,000 letters in his lifetime to all kinds of people. So you might only see a few letters to an individual, but that doesn't mean that they're not important to him. And that might mean that he had a chance to meet with them and talk with them, and it didn't result necessarily in the letters in the published collections. And of course, in 1954, when The Doors of Perception came out, Aldous attended the Parapsychology Foundation, and I'd have to check my own notes to see what the exact name at that time was. Slightly had a different name. It's Le Piau in Saint Paul de Vence in the south of France, and that there was an interesting roster there. And some of those individuals who attended that meeting became part of a group that were, let's put it this way, then I'll go back to this in a minute. Timothy Leary might not have been a name known to us if Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond had been able to pursue the study the way they wanted to. And many people were involved in this study called Outsight. And if we have time, I'll tell you more about that. But back to Eileen Garrett and their friendship. So Aldous talked about the far continents of the mind at that 1954 Parapsychology Foundation seminar in France. And his idea of far continents of the mind really was that we need to go beyond our familiar geography, our familiar psychological geography, in order to access these other strange lands that really haven't been fully explored. And that was the idea, really, was to explore the psyche. Certainly at the time, the only psyche exploration that was going on was Freudian and behaviorist. So remember, the 1950s, the Freudians really had a lock hold, and the behaviorists in the universities on any of these studies. In fact, my dad's hand study, which was replicated by the chair of the psychology department at UCLA, and they presented it together, they were hooted down at the American Anthropological Foundation when they presented their study. And that study was then shelved by Dr. Gingerelli, who said to my dad, I can't do this because my job's at stake. We can't do it now. He published after he retired. He published a brief on the study. So back to Eileen Garrett. And so they're good friends, and they communicate a lot. And Aldous Huxley's first wife, Maria, was a very dear friend of Eileen Garrett. They had an affinity because they were both very intuitive. Maria was a very intuitive person. You can imagine someone like that being the helpmate of someone like Aldous, who was so cerebral. What a combination they must have been. Very different from his second wife, Laura. Different kind of relationship entirely. So Maria was very affectionately involved with Eileen Garrett. And when she would come with Aldous to these meetings, and also when Aldous and Maria were in New York, because they traveled a lot, they would get together with Eileen. I don't have those records because they didn't result in letters. They were face-to-face meetings. And then at that first meeting in 1954, interested in non-traditional healing for a long time. But this suddenly gave it a new urgency because Maria had breast cancer. And Aldous didn't know it at the time, but Maria was really already in a recurrent condition. And so part of that 1954 Parapsychology Foundation also became focused for them. They worked with Eileen in a room that I only know about because it was a line or two in a letter to Osmond, where they were doing I don't want to call it magnetic healing, but it would be a kind of energy healing that apparently was something of deep interest to all of them. And also my father. My father was a healer in that area as well. So those are some of the areas, and I know two things as well. That after Maria died, and I didn't include this in the book because I guess it was because I felt it was taking this point a little bit too far, but I'm happy to be able to share this with you. And this was in the letters between Osmond and Huxley. When Maria Huxley died, and remember that Aldous had gone through meditations with her as she lay dying, including reading from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but other kinds of meditations as well. He called forth, as he described in a very long letter to Osmond, recreating where they'd lived in the desert, because Maria had had a lot of spontaneous experiences that one might call mystical in their desert home in Mojave. And Aldous used certain terms as Maria was dying. And then Eileen Garrett got a hold of Aldous after this and said, Maria came to me, and I'm paraphrasing here, and this was from a letter that was from Aldous to Osmond. Maria came to me and wanted me to let you know that the way you helped her during her dying was wonderful. And she wanted me to thank you. And then Eileen said to Aldous, what were these words? And there were 3 or 4 words that Eileen couldn't quite pick up and said something like, they were kind of garbled, but they were words that Aldous knew exactly what she meant. So there was a sense of transference on lots of levels there, a sense of remote communication on so many levels that is very poignant But I felt that, and I wanted to include that in the book, but I felt that I had to pull back a little bit. I had to pull back on a few things. I pulled back on some of my own family experiences. I felt that the more I let the psychedelics carry the story, the more the other parts of the book that were about these anomalous experiences would be allowed to live. And my publisher wouldn't say, you know, because Prometheus is they're quite scholarly. You see the book, you'll see lots of indexes and footnotes and things. And I didn't want to distract, but I'm really so happy to have a chance to talk about some of these things today. So I guess those are some of some of the most important connections with Eileen Garrett, and I know that their friendship lasted to the end of his life.
Yeah, definitely. He was very important to the foundation. Shirley had asked, what did the psychedelic hands, what did the hands what did they look like? How did your father go about making those photographs?
He had a childhood experience where a hand reader predicted his father's death when he was a young boy, and he'd been present to hear it. And it was so specific and odd the way it happened, and then it happened that way. So that was in the back of his mind. He didn't think about that, I don't think, until he became involved in the war effort and was recruited to teach classes by the defense industry. And he created a way to, had to do with a design for aircraft. And things were a rush after the Pearl Harbor bombing, and the mission was to quickly decide who was talented at this kind of drafting. So my dad designed a test that would wash out those who didn't have the skill right away. There was no time for college. You had to decide who had this skill latently. As he kind of, as a man would do, would shake the hands of those who had succeeded and kind of wish well those who hadn't. He noticed that there seemed to be some slightly different characteristics that he was sensing about those handshakes. He remembered his childhood experience and decided to pursue this as a study. He developed a camera that would enable him to get incredibly fine-grained photographs by using a reversal process. So they're negatives with white on black. He would use kind of a toothpaste solution he devised. So setting it up that way, that sets you up as how these photographs were taken. They weren't just a hand shot. They were very detailed. And he set about then to look for different traits. That's why he was taking photographs of stutterers initially and various people. Because he had access to, including the Long Beach Convention Center, he would hone in on the conventions, contact their directors, say, I'm doing this study. Can I take photographs of some of your members? Members apparently thought it was great, including the LA Philharmonic Orchestra. So people sort of signed into this. And one of those groups happened to be a group of psychics who were at a conference in Long Beach, California. Again, LA being very much the center of a lot of these interests. So he has a lot of those. Now, we can't determine which of them were the more successful or the more effective, but he does have an array of those hand photographs. Now, to your question about what did this look like, this little feature in the hand. He found it first in the schizophrenic patients. I describe it in the book, but there is a configuration in the grain, it's in the grain pattern, that creates an indicator. And he was able to, and also working with one of the directors at the Norwalk Mental Hospital, now called Metropolitan in LA, who actually, the director, I believe it was the director, I could never quite pin the individual down, but he noticed it first when they laid out a lot of these hands of their schizophrenic patients. And they were looking to say, what are we looking for? What are we looking for? This little indicator came up at that meeting. My dad singled that out, and then he started looking at some of the other groups he had. And that one of them was the group of psychics. And he noticed it wasn't in all of them, because probably it would be in the more sensitive, the more successful. And when you have a conference, a convention, I don't know how the one would, what kind of threshold you might have to indicate. So it's a little triangular indicator in the hand. I describe it in the book. I don't show the picture because I felt that was getting too technical. But I think this might be part of my making these materials available to a researcher now that the book is out if someone wanted to inquire. It doesn't jump out at you, but once you see it, you see it. There used to be those little descriptors that, what is this tangle of lines? I mentioned this in the book. What is this tangle of lines? It's a cow. Oh, look, there's a cow. And suddenly you can see the shape. So that's your answer, long answer to your question about the indicator in the hands. It's not something that were in any of the classical palmistry books. My dad's view was that to a certain extent palmistry was like a crystal ball, was like really just an access point for sensitives. That was his personal view of that. Particularly because when he showed this at a hobby show in Long Beach in the 50s, and the word got out, and some of the psychics in the area came to see these. Turned out that there were several men who wrote for a magazine called Chimes, which was a magazine about psychic phenomena, published in the 50s up to the 60s in California. And my father had samples of hands as blow-ups at the hobby show posted on the wall. And the psychics couldn't figure out which of these hands belonged to specific people, who was the musician, who was the stutterer, who was the schizophrenic. They couldn't get it because they didn't have an actual hand in their hand. They didn't have that access point. So he thought that was interesting. And that kind of reinforced my dad's idea that however one accesses, if one is a sensitive, it's not so easy to just say you have a lifeline or a whatever. It might lead one into that interior world where you're reading someone's life and their patterns, but that it's not easy to make that an abstraction.
I don't remember who said this, maybe Brian will, but I know there was some discussion back in the day about the idea that a lot of these methodologies were, as your father thought, focusers for people who needed something to do while they were unleashing their sensitivities, and also something to blame if what they came across was negative and they felt they needed to communicate it. It's, sorry, it's in your hand. Sorry, it's in the ball, the crystal ball. Sorry, it's in the vision. What can I do? Kind of a thing. So I think there's been a lot of discussion over the years, and my brain is dead at the moment, so I can't remember where I read this, but that there's the methodology, and the methodology serves social and emotional purposes, but may not be as indicative as the sensitive is saying. It's really what is coming to them. It's really what they're bringing to the experience, and they may overlay onto that methodology of scrying or whatever it might be. So,
yes,
discussion that you did the other day. The Facebook page is called Aldous Huxley.
I did.
Okay. So
they were more, my
purpose
was more getting this discussion out to my general reader, because since I really weave so many topics together here, this is wonderful. I love that I can be focused with you folks today. Whereas for some people, this is not the part of it they're interested in. I'd say again, for the general social media purposes, a little more on the psychedelic side. The classic picture of Aldous standing up on the hill the day he took mescaline in May of 1954, and a few kind of fun pictures of various things. So I was blogging every half hour in kind of related ways about the book. I think you can access. It was an event called like the launch event, and I think you can. It's up there, so I think you can access it that way. For anyone who might be interested, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just scrolled.
Yeah, indeed.
It would be, I don't know if you've thought about doing this, but Stacey Horn, who wrote the book Unbelievable, which was that kind of episodic treatment of the history of the Rhine Center, she has a marvelous blog that she's still adding to periodically from research that wasn't able to be put into the book without going off onto too many side tangents for the general reader. And it's been a marvelous resource for those of us who are teaching, in fact, because there's all these lovely tidbits that come out about the connections between people. And I've been amazed since Carlos and I first worked on site at the Parapsychology Foundation in 2000, the amount of correspondence is still available there in the stories that Mrs. Coley and Eileen and Lisette were telling. Eileen had such a huge group of friends and colleagues in all the various areas that she was interested in, from publishing to theater to the intellectual side of psychic experiences and beliefs and phenomena, and also psychedelics and altered states and her abilities and so on. And it's like Aldous Huxley, she was a wonderful letter writer. Put a lot of insight into the things that she wrote in her own books and then in her correspondence as well. So we always heard this about Huxley, that Doors of Perception was, when I got to be a college student in the 60s, was like a number one on the list, and it was just a delight to hear Lizette and Mrs. Coley talk about Maria and all this and the relationship to the foundation and how much a part of the family foundation they were and how wide his interests were. And as later on in life, Carlos and I did history of science at Duke, and getting to know his ancestor, who was the anti-Darwin guy, Thomas Huxley, it was an even bigger sort of perverse delight.
Oh, and by the way,
completely.
I'll interrupt for a second just to say that T.H. Huxley, his grandfather, who was called Darwin's bulldog, he was the man who coined the word agnostic.
Oh, I didn't know that. He was a character, and reading about him was very interesting. And I can't remember the quote exactly, but he sat with mediums because that was happening in the day, and said he just hoped there wasn't an afterlife because he didn't want to find himself speaking twaddle like all the people who talk to the mediums. And so very interesting. I
have one thing to clear up, I think. I noticed someone asked a question about the photographs that Aldous took. Aldous didn't take photographs. Yeah, my father did. Okay. But there is a photograph that was taken this to me was amazing, that this area of the hands was important to Aldous up to his death, because you probably are all aware that he took LSD on his deathbed, not as a exit strategy, but as kind of almost like a sacrament, secular sacrament. But within the last month of his death, he had a photograph of his hand taken, not by my dad, but by someone. It wasn't a very clear photograph, but I think it underlines the importance of it to him. He signed the front, and it was framed on the wall when I interviewed Laura Huxley the first time. Laura Huxley. She loaned it to me, gave me permission to use it in the book as well. And when I took it to my photo lab to have it scanned in for later digital use, I turned it over, and on the back it was dated the week before Huxley's death. A week before his death, the hand was important enough to him to have this done and signed, probably, it might have been taken a month before, and dated. And I was just blown away by that. So my dad was the one who took the photographs. The last photograph that's in the book of his hand, which is not a very detailed one, but has his signature on it, was taken by an unknown photographer. And I just wanted to clear that up because I'm looking at the chat here and I saw that was Howard Thrasher. My maiden name was Thrasher.
And your dad, what's your dad's first name?
Frank.
Can you write it into the chat for us?
He didn't. He was an engineer, but that one publication published by Gengarelli was credited to him as well. Yes, it's in the. I have footnotes and index and so forth. It's in the footnotes in my book. The specific publication where it appeared, but it was one of the majors in the 70s. After Gengarelli retired. Yeah, so that's... we're well aware of these wonderful academic obstacles a lot of us face. In fact, I found it amazing that Prometheus published your book, because back in the day when Paul Kurtz was alive and involved with its content, they not only were not as academic as they are now, or right down the street from the Skeptical Inquirer, very different mindset than I am. So it's all this interesting when I'm interested in all these things in our household. But yes, that's one of the reasons, as I said, I wanted to get this story in as part of the theme, but I knew I had to pull some things back, and I carried it along on the raft of psychedelic research, and I'm happy about that. Marvelous. Maurice is asking, was there any influence of Krishnamurti one of my mini blogs on that little lunch event, by the way, is about that. And then it takes you to a little blog I did about that. I went to visit the Krishnamurti Foundation, the retreat, which is a beautiful place, and stayed in Aldous Huxley's room where he would stay with Maria. And while I was there, read a lot of the material that they had in their library. And what to me was interesting was in Aldous Huxley writes about this. Christopher Isherwood writes about this because he was very involved in the Vedanta Society. And he said Krishnamurti was Aldous Huxley's version of his following a guru. But of course, Krishnamurti was anti-guru, notably. He broke away from the Theosophical Society and established with their blessings, actually, as it turns out, and established his own kind of path, and certainly had a huge number of followers. So his way would be to take a walk in the grove in Ojai, and someone might walk with him, and a subject might come up, and it was never, as I understand it, not particularly directly addressed, as much as it would come out between the lines. And of course, Aldous loved this sort of thing. And in fact, Aldous was the one who encouraged Krishnamurti to publish his first volume of his work, because these were incidentals. And Aldous would visit him in Ojai, he and Maria.
Wow.
And that was the instigation of Krishnamurti's first volumes. Aldous encouraging him, the person who would spot a publishing opportunity for someone and say, that needs to be put down, that needs to be recorded and made available. So yes, they had and when I love this, when Krishnamurti first met Aldous, and this was in when I spent my little Ojai weekend there, Krishnamurti wrote to someone, well, today I met Aldous Huxley, and yes, he's an intellectual, but he's so much more than that. I love that idea.
That's lovely. Thanks, Maurice, for asking that question.
Humphrey Osmond and John Smithies, who I mentioned to you, they were the psychiatrists who were working in schizophrenia and working with mescaline, which led to Dort's perception. But what they had as early researchers in the psychedelic field, they felt very strongly that the connection between psychedelic research, or let's say mysticism and madness, was something that was really valuable to pursue, not only on the therapeutic side, but on the side of exposing more people in a measured way, in a controlled way, to this experience, so that there would be, and remember, this was a time in the 50s when you had nuclear testing going on. It was alarming, a little bit like our times in some ways. So Humphrey Osmond and John Smithies devised the idea of a study that would involve very high-level people in philosophy, psychology, the arts, who would be part of a think tank, and their experience, again, supervised by Osmond and Smithies. They would pool their articulation about their experience. And these would be highly articulate and highly respected people in different fields. Carl Jung was one of the people who espoused this idea. I mean, he was a supporter, like on the board of this planned think tank. He also told Aldous, I don't really need to take mescaline because I see this all the time. But so it was, when Aldous got involved, he embraced the idea. He tried to help raise funds for this, funds from the Ford Foundation, from the Rockefeller Foundation, both very much controlled by the behaviorist factions at the time and the Freudians. So they didn't get any funding for this idea of what would have been an amazing study that would have, it would not have, it's been criticized by those who see the importance of making psychedelic drugs available to everyone, which I personally do not think is a good idea, as an elitist project. It's often called elitist. Yes, it was elitist, for a very good reason. They wanted to have high-level participants. They wanted highly articulated responses from these participants, their perspective on it, collect it in a published work, make this the snowball effect, upward, not downward. It turned out to be a downward effect after Timothy Leary. And that staunched research that was valuable and is now coming back. So that was the Outside Project, and Huxley and Osmond write about it in the letters, and Osmond was trying to find people. He was a friend of the, name eludes me at this moment, of the Ford Foundation in the 1950s. They had a lot of money to spend. They actually, this friend of Aldous's came and, to his home for dinner one night and said, this money to spend. Do you have any ideas? Yes. Here's an idea. support this, this project. But again, there were too many people pushing against anything that would lead away. That whole area of biochemical research at the time in the area of mental illness and anything to do with that was considered anathema, and it wasn't supported.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a very difficult time. Were you saying outside?
And outside, and I'll tell you why. You'd think of insight, wouldn't you? It seems counterintuitive, but inside, anybody can trip insight inwardly. Aldous wanted this to be outside, O-U-T-S-I-G-H-T, because it can change the way you see the world. And he was, particularly, as I say, in the 50s, we had, nuclear testing going on. One of the individuals who was eager to be part of this think tank group was D.T. Suzuki, the Zen scholar, and, certainly a big name at that time. He was very, very keen on this happening as soon as possible, because they felt that it would draw attention away from some of the warmongering going on, try to shift some focus in this country, shift some of the effort in this country in a new direction, open up a new light, not in a sort of woo-woo way, but really a practical application of this. That if you could get this in the hands of some of the people who are decision makers, you could enable them to see things slightly differently. Not just give up life and put on your sandals and whatever, but I think, as we all know, insights into other dimensions really change your take on every decision you make in your life. So that was outside, O-U-T-S-I-G-H-T. Hasn't been written about, to the best of my knowledge, anywhere. So that's one of the pieces I bring to Aldous's life and his biography.
That's wonderful. It's very interesting. It's such a great idea. A lot of researchers today would resonate to that, and intellectuals and spiritual seekers and so on. Brian was just putting up a bit of history about Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who is Ram Dass now. And Leary was running around the field of parapsychology trying to get absolutely everybody he could find to try LSD and see what happened. And I'm pretty sure he's the guy who was credited with bringing the LSD to the Rhine Center back in the day when they were at Duke and getting, I think Louisa and J.B. Rhine, definitely J.B. Rhine, Gaither Pratt, some of the other staff members to try it. And there's some, and again, I can't remember if I saw this in Gaither Pratt's biography or if it was in Dennis Bryan's Enchanted Voyager, which is a kind of a snarky biography of Rhine that's mainly unedited interviews. But the thing that rolls around the field in the background is that Rhine was just very quiet and didn't seem to change at all, and didn't have any visual experiences, and it was just that the lab thought he was quite a bit nicer the next couple of days than he normally was to the staff, and the rest of them had experiences.
Well, that might to your point about back to the idea that if you see the world through these new glasses, it can be a life-changing experience, certainly. But I was going to say back to Leary for a moment. Huxley, in one of his letters, and this is, again, I had just going through these letters was an amazing thing. I just locked myself in a hotel room for like 2 days and poured into it. But one of them was a visit to Rhine. He writes to Osmond, and he said that, and this was before Leary by several years, half a dozen years easily, that he and Rhine were talking about, again, all this work, because mescaline was Aldous's entry point. LSD came a little bit later. But Aldous and his circle of friends were experimenting with different natural substances at the time as well. And I guess there was some interest at that time. Some of Rhine's people were doing a little bit of experimenting, but these were much milder. One was from the morning glory vine, a type of, I'm going to mispronounce it, soliloquy. But none of those weren't really as controlled as the later. It's hard to work with these if you don't have quality control over your product, let's say, for these substances. But he was discussing this with Rhine much before Leary. But once LSD became available, of course, that was the one that caught wildfire. So I was going to mention about my use of psychedelic.
Yeah.
The research they do today, they usually, it's still very split. The people working in the areas of spiritual applications call it entheogens. Dr. Charles Grobe, who's one of the leading researchers, he's here at UCLA, and I interviewed him in my book. He prefers the word hallucinogen, which, by the way, Osmond and Huxley rejected as a too narrow word, which is why Osmond coined psychedelics to be more encompassing. But Grobe prefers hallucinogen because psychedelic has baggage. And so his book is about hallucinogen, and he prefers that term. So it's still all over the place. The people, the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, they work a lot with MDMA, though they support, work in other kinds of studies, but that's their particular focus. But they call it an entactogen. That's one aspect of the application, that kind of interactive, the empathy that is possible from an MDMA. So it kind of has all these little tendrils. And then when you get into areas like these days like ayahuasca, which is very trendy, then that opens up a whole other area. None of those were known to Aldous. Every day these days you have the synthetic of the day sort of situation.
Well, we had a conference in the Parapsychological Association had a conference in Curitiba in Brazil, like 2012 or 2010 or 11 or something like that. And Dr. David Luke was the program chair for that conference. He's the guy from Greenwich, and he uses the term psychopharmaceuticals. But we had a whole panel on ayahuasca and not just the connection to a psychic phenomena, but also a number of individuals who have been researchers into ayahuasca and its effects and its potential usages in psychotherapy and so on. And it was absolutely fascinating. So that particular, through Bill Roll, who Brian Williams was mentioning, was probably the first person who talked about ayahuasca in our field, and through, especially now, David at Greenwich, we get a lot of kind of overlap between that line of research and what goes on in our field, because certainly altered states are still as important as they always were in terms of their connection to psychic experience and psychic phenomena and so on, and belief as well. So as you said, a life transformative experience very often. And now there's a very active research group at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and they have a number of young people who are working on the effects of ayahuasca in the Santo Daime, religious context, where they're every Sunday. And one of his graduate students did a PhD dissertation on the impact on the children of the church members who were exposed to ayahuasca at a very early age. So it's very interesting. It's very timely, I think, and we certainly are in a similar type of an era as to the 50s now, with in our country, in the way politics are moving and this sort of huge emphasis on war and all that. So definitely time for more outside.
But it is interesting, too, that the grant writing, of course, I haven't mentioned the little side effect that many of you know, and that was in the 50s. The CIA was very involved in this. There's a letter to Osmond from Aldous about when he was visiting Rhine and saying, oh, I just heard about the government is doing some work here with some of these substances. So it sort of like nails it in the timeline. But that also enabled a lot of the studies that went on all over, because many of the grant money was filtered through intermediaries. So I think a lot of the universities had no idea that where the money was coming from, but they were suddenly getting funding for a lot of their research. And then when much of this proved not to be effective as an interrogation device for mind control, that money dried up. And then all of a sudden, that was part of the perfect storm, you could call it, of ending the psychedelic era, because a lot of that research money went away. Even someone like Ken Kesey back then, started his whole career of writing in these areas by being a subject at Stanford in one of the CIA funded, and it's well known now that these were CIA government funded. And the reason they were CIA and not FBI is because they expected to have an international effect. by using this against Russian spies, so, which didn't work out. Wasn't necessary.
Does anybody have any more questions about Aileen's book? And I'm going to go to the next slide so you can see that the click-throughs are live when you download the PowerPoint, and you can search on Prometheus Press and also on Amazon.com to pick it up. As well as I recommend looking for the Facebook group, because I think that's a great place to find out more information about the content of the book as well, and all of these wonderful things that Aileen has been sharing with us. So if there are no more questions, then I just want to say thank you so much for another epic talk. We had an epic talk yesterday, and this is an epic talk today. You shared a lot of very interesting things about the process and the content of the book and Aldous Huxley and so on. And of course, the recording will be ready in probably 24 hours. I'm sorry if you're hearing a little bit of an echo. And I want to thank you all for hanging into the whole process of the Book Expo from November to now. Don't forget, if you haven't seen the rest of the presentations, the recordings are there on the course schedule, and they will all be up on the Parapsychology Foundation YouTube channel by Tuesday, I'm hoping, with the MP4s going out to the folks who spoke for us. Remember that the Paramount 2016 will start on Monday, January 18th. We've moved it back a week because of personal reasons. The Paramount is Parapsychology and Anomalistic Psychology Research and Education. This year we'll have 6 weeks as usual. We'll have 15 speakers, discussion sessions, and some introductory lectures thrown in there. And on the 23rd and 24th of January, we'll, kind of in the middle of the MOOC, the Parapsychology Foundation will also be running the Parapsychology Foundation International Affiliates Conference, day long on Saturday and Sunday, the 23rd and 24th, with presentations by 8 of the international affiliates. And you can find out who the affiliates are by going to www.parapsychology.org. It's on the main website. Just look under Programs and International Affiliates, and you'll see the complete list of who are the folks who represent us in other countries. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. Thank you so much, Eileen. This has been really excellent, and I am going to go buy that book and put it on my Kindle right now. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon, and look for us on Facebook and for Aileen as well. Thank you so much.